Elizabeth Warren is finally sounding alarms on what the reality is of our economic situation. And I say finally because we keep hearing the media regurgitate talking points about how the economy is doing so well. Oh my God, would you look at the GDP? Would you look at how the stock market's doing? But if you just do a little bit deeper dive, you'll find that the economy is not doing well. And so in a Medium post, Elizabeth Warren outlined all of the various issues that our economy is facing today. She says, quote, "I see a manufacturing sector in recession. I see a precarious economy that is built on debt." Let me just read that part again. "I see a precarious economy that is built on debt, both household debt and corporate debt, and that is vulnerable to shocks. And I see a number of serious shocks on the horizon that could cause our economy's shaky foundation to crumble." Finally, someone's talking about the debt. Finally, and I'm not talking about the national debt. I'm talking about consumer debt and also corporate debt. This is a huge issue that no one's been paying attention to, and it's been driving me nuts, and I'm glad she's drawing attention to it. She says the student debt load has more than doubled since the financial crisis. American credit card debt matches its 2008 peak. Auto loan debt is the highest it has ever been since we started tracking it nearly 20 years ago. And a record 7 million Americans are behind on their auto loans, many of which have similar abusive characteristics as pre-crash subprime mortgages. 71 million American adults, more than 30% of the adults in the country already have debts in collection.
Yeah.
Okay, there's more, but yeah. Come on.
So look, this is pitch perfect. So for two different reasons. Just this weekend, I had multiple conversations with progressive leaders, and we all coincidentally were saying, look, somebody's got to start saying the economy's gonna crash, because it's gonna crash. And so if we don't get out in front of it, what Trump is gonna do immediately is blame Democrats. Now, for what? He's in charge, right? It doesn't matter, he's gonna make it up. He's gonna say, Warren was leading in the polling, or Sanders was, or Biden was, or something. So the markets thought they might, blah, 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 blah. They thought he might win, and that's why, not me, it's not me, it's not me, right? No, that is why it's so important for Elizabeth Warren and others to come out and say, this economy is built to bust, okay? It has been inflated and inflated. The tax cuts further inflated it. All they did was take the stock buybacks. So the markets are artificially inflated, and the number one driver of that is the debt. So that's the second part that Anna's referring to. Also pitch perfect, exactly right. Naomi Prince on this show, wonderful financial scholar, talking about how the debts that the companies are holding is a time bomb. And Elizabeth Warren talks about 25% of those companies have way too much debt that's set to explode.
Yes, can I give you the excerpt from her piece that talks about that a little bit? She writes, leveraged corporate lending to companies that are already seriously in debt has jumped by 40% since Trump took office, spreading systemic risk throughout our financial system. These high-risk loans now make up a quarter of all American business loans, and they look a lot like the pre-2008 subprime mortgages. Poorly underwritten loans with minimal protections that are then packaged and sold to investors. So understand what's happening there. Once that is set to explode, all of these individuals, average Americans who are enjoying the success of the stock market today, who have invested their retirement accounts in the stock market, they're gonna feel the pain once this explodes.
Yeah, so look guys, this is her wheelhouse. She is great at this. And she is right to have her hair on fire here, because when the markets crash and the economy crashes, millions of people lose their jobs. And so she's right politically, because I don't want anyone getting it confused later, and they will try their hardest to confuse us as to whose fault this was. So that is why it's important to say it ahead of time and show the reasons why it's gonna happen. Elizabeth Warren's done this before. She wrote a book back in 2003 explaining how the subprime loans were going to be a problem, and those mortgages were gonna collapse and the housing industry was gonna collapse. She nailed that 5 years ahead of time. No one's better at this than Elizabeth Warren is. And she's right about the scale of the disaster that would come if these things blow up. And if you don't change anything, they will. The only thing that I'll add to it, and this is, she didn't need to address it necessarily in this piece. I think she got this exactly right. but they all have to move on to the next part. How do you solve it? I know she had descriptions in her proposal for how to solve it, and they're all wonderful, but the real problem is the corruption. And Elizabeth Warren was the only person to mention it during the debates, so I love that. But you gotta dig deeper. It's not just Republicans. A lot of Democratic senators aid and abet this.
Yes.
And if you don't have the courage to call out your colleagues on this thing's gonna blow.
Yeah, that's a great point, because she did list solutions like increasing minimum wage to $15 an hour, forgiving student loan debt, things that we've heard from her before. But you're right, I mean, this is, what we're seeing right now is a symptom of a much larger issue, and it is the government corruption. So she definitely should call that out and propose more to actually stop it, mitigate it. You get the picture. But one other thing I have to add that she didn't mention it in this piece, and it was a lengthy piece. I'm not trying to be like overly critical, but non-bank lenders now give out more mortgages, more than 50% of mortgages than the big banks. And the reason why I mention that is because Dodd-Frank doesn't regulate the non-bank lenders. And so they're like doling out mortgages to people who just went bankrupt, okay? Like the whole subprime mortgage crisis is in the works again. And it's so frustrating that no one's paying attention to it. So that's another thing to pay attention to.
So last two things, I don't want anybody to get it wrong. I'm not saying Elizabeth Warren is not doing a good job of calling out corruption. She's actually probably the best in the field right now. But they all need to do it a lot more than they are now. Because if we're gonna pass anything, you're gonna need all the Democrats to vote yes, whether it's fixing healthcare or it's fixing Wall Street. And unfortunately, a lot of the Democrats are gonna vote no because they get that same corporate donation. If you're worried about being polite to them, we're never gonna fix any of this stuff. That goes to the whole field. Now, lastly, on this issue, I thought her piece in Medium was, again, nearly perfect. But I want you to understand, she's not doing this just because she's a progressive. It's actually the correct financial analysis. I've heard this from other people that I know that work on Wall Street, and former chair of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, also said, and she's been warning for several months now. She said, quote, "There has been a huge deterioration in standards. Covenants have been loosened in leveraged lending." If you don't know the details of it, guys, I spent years covering this in the last collapse. Leveraged lending is everything. That is when they gamble on the already bad loans, but they gamble at a much higher level. So when it collapses, the collapse is much larger. So whatever it is, subprime lending in the case of housing, or in this now, the most likely point of the collapse will be the corporate debt, but that's the trigger. The gun is leveraged lending.
Yes.
And the former head of the Federal Reserve is saying, she said, quote, "I am worried about the systemic risks associated with these loans." So Elizabeth Warren is not telling you, hey, I'd like a progressive society that does this and this. She's saying something that everyone should agree to. Like, we have got to stop this train before it crashes. And anyone with any sense recognizes that. Unfortunately, almost no one else in government has any sense. On the go? Don't worry, we got you covered. You can still listen to TYT at our new podcast network. Find us on Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or at tyt.com/podcast.